Good morning. If you're here in Madison, it's a delight to see you. Please have a seat and we'll get underway. And if you're with us online, welcome to the 2024 Election Symposium, sponsored by the Elections Research Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm Barry Burden. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science here at UW and director of the ERC. This is, I think, our fifth symposium. We started back in 2016, which was also a shocker. And here we are again. All these years later. We have a really amazing lineup of speakers for you today, academic experts, pollsters, journalists, and a great Q&A to follow every presentation. So I think we're going to have a good conversation and learn some things that we don't yet know. The event, as I mentioned, is made possible by the Elections Research Center. The ERC is in turn supported by the Lyons Family Chair in Electoral Politics. So we are thankful for that. The event itself is only possible because of Jess Esplin, who is there taking my photo. Can we give her a round of applause? We'll be here together all day. If you're here in person, we'll have lunch at noon. Please join us whether you've registered for lunch or not. It'll be available in the room. There's also a cafe just next door and some places to eat and get other things across the way at Union South, so take advantage of the area. We will have questions and a moderated Q&A following each presentation. If you're in the room, there are index cards on which you can write your questions, and we'll have students gathering those and bringing them up to the moderator so that they can ask questions to the presenters. If you're online on Zoom with us, the Q&A function in Zoom is the way to ask your question, not the chat function. So submit those questions anytime in the midst of the presentation, and moderators will be trying to watch both the online Q&A and the in-the-room questions and to fold that all into the conversation. So it should be a good connection between all of those things. There's also one special session today labeled as On the Cutting Edge at 2:30. Those are actually research posters that will be outside just to the left as you exit the door here. Those of you online won't be able to see them, but for those of you who are here, please take an hour and spend some time seeing what our students have worked on this year, elections-wise. Okay, I want to open the day with some ways of thinking about the 2024 presidential elections, some questions it raised, and a couple of narratives, I think, that are possible explanations for what happened and hopefully will be revealed in the course of the sessions today. Let's start with results. As a reminder of what happened almost a month ago, Donald Trump has won the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. It's a rare instance where the Republican candidate has won the popular vote. It's about 1.5 points. Nationally, almost 50% of the votes cast nationwide, and an Electoral College vote of 312. He won back all of the swing states that had gone to Biden 4 years ago and won all 7 states that were widely seen as the battlegrounds this year. Those are shaded with the diagonal red lines. So it was a decisive win, not a landslide, not a realignment in my view, but a convincing victory in both the Electoral College and the popular vote. There were also gains down the ballot for Republicans in the U.S. Senate, with Bob Casey's concession just in the last few hours. I think in Pennsylvania, we now, it looks like, are going to have 53 Republicans in the Senate. That's an increase from the 49 that are there today, plus J.D. Vance as vice president will serve as the tiebreaker. So a solid Republican majority there, flipping 4 states in the Republican direction and no states flipping in the Democratic direction. In the House on the lower right, things look pretty much the way they did before the election. Republicans will have a bare majority of somewhere around 221 when these last couple of races in California are called. There are a couple of Republicans who are being withdrawn from the Congress by Donald Trump to serve in the cabinet. So if that happens, it may be a slimmer majority, but it does look like a Republican trifecta. Republicans in control of the presidency, the Senate, and the House. Now, how did we get there? That's the outcome. This feels like more of a roller coaster of a campaign than anyone I have observed. Just a tremendous number of unprecedented events, things that we have not seen before, including incumbent presidents stepping down from the campaign after all the primaries and caucuses, following a terrible debate for Joe Biden in late June, him being replaced by his vice presidential running mate in a matter of days, and the Democratic Party embracing her very quickly and very effectively, launching into a $1 billion fundraising effort in about a month. It's a remarkable change of direction. Also, an assassination attempt against the Republican candidate who was a former president of the United States and who immediately went to the Republican convention 2 days later with a bandage on his ear at the height, I think, of Republican success during the campaign. Just so many things you would say make this campaign unlike any other, make it less predictable than any other election, just put it on a trajectory and a kind of crazy path that could not have been seen. And the polls maybe bear that out. This is a summary of all of the polls done through summer and up till beginning of the summer and up till the general election in the New York Times. So you don't see the individual surveys here, but just the summaries. And the ups and downs of this roller coaster ride, I think, are evident here. You can see that the campaign was pretty close, at least in the national popular vote, until that debate at the end of June. Very quickly, Trump pulled ahead, even before Biden was pushed out of the race. That was clearly part of the messaging to Biden about why he ought to step aside. So it goes from a dead-even race nationally to a Republican advantage of about 3 points within a matter of a week. The assassination attempt happens in Butler, PA, July 13th. The Republicans are continuing to ride the polls. And then Biden leaves the race after the Republican convention and essentially stops the bleeding for the Democrats at that point. Kamala Harris enters. You can see the jump in the line. And it very quickly, within a matter of days, goes to a Democratic advantage. Building through the early Harris events, the flood of fundraising and volunteers who came to that campaign, a pretty successful Democratic convention, through the first debate, the interviews, all the things that happened to Harris on the way to the general election ending, and then a bit of a trail down near the end, from 3 or 4 point advantage for Democrats at their height to a 1 point advantage as an average of the polls at the end. So it looks like a crazy ride in the polls that reflects the craziness of the events. You might say this was the path. There was a beginning we thought we understood in January or February. There was an ending we can now make sense of, and there's just all this stuff happening in between. That's one version of events, and I think we're going to get some of that today. But there's another more boring version that political scientists, I think, are inclined to believe. And that's that despite all of the craziness of the campaign, there were some fundamental factors that we could see in advance that drove the election in a particular way that worked through all of that day-to-day noise. Forecast, in fact, my students in the class this semester did forecasts of the election and predicted that Harris would win 260 electoral votes, not very far from where she ended up, and would be slightly behind in the popular vote. And that's without any knowledge of who the candidates were, what the issues were, how many assassinations were happening, who spoke at the conventions, or anything else. So there is a straight line version of this, and I'm going to give you a flavor of that in a moment. There maybe is a compromise version, which is there's some wackiness happening in the campaign. There were certainly some unprecedented things that must have changed the direction of the campaign, particularly the swapping out of Biden for Harris in late June and early July. But there still is a kind of fundamental thread running through things that was probably bigger than those daily events. So let me give you some of those background factors that I think were so important, but many of us missed in the course of the campaign. One is that the public is just generally unhappy and has been unhappy for a while. This is a Gallup question going back to the 1970s, asking people whether they're basically satisfied with the direction of the United States. Are they happy with where it's going? It goes up and down, at least historically. It's risen and fallen, often with the state of the economy. When times are good, say in the mid-90s, as the economy was rising and stock market was doing well, and the housing bubble was happening, and we didn't realize it was a bubble, people were pretty pleased. And when there's a recession or some other downturn, satisfaction tends to drop. But for the last 15 years, it's essentially been a low, flat line with something like 25 to 30% of the public saying they're satisfied, and a large majority saying they are dissatisfied. Some of that is surely COVID and inflation and the things we've been experiencing for the last 5 years, but it must be more than that. This predates Donald Trump, it predates Joe Biden, it maybe predates Barack Obama, but there's a sort of settling in of discontent that's going to be taken out on someone at election time, and this time around it was Democrats who were in the White House. So this is something that even a very successful Harris campaign probably could not have overcome. We also know from political science research that the approval ratings of the incumbent president are pretty tightly connected to election outcomes, even if that president, himself or herself, is not on the ballot. So here's some data from John Sides and his co-authors, one of whom is here, showing the relationship between the president's approval rating in June. This is before the national conventions, before the running mates, the debates, and all the things that happen in the fall campaign, and then the share of the vote that the incumbent party gets in the fall election. Again, irrespective of whether it's actually that president running for re-election or merely someone from his party, there's a very strong relationship between approval ratings and election outcomes, as you'd expect. When the public thinks the person in the White House is doing a better job, they tend to win more votes. You'll see the green dots are cases where the incumbent party won. Red dots are cases where the incumbent party lost. As of June, Joe Biden's approval rating was about 38%. So you find that on the graph on the bottom and trace your way up. There are no winning presidents, no administrations that continue for another term when they're in that territory. Now, it's possible if the public is discontent that every president is now going to have approval ratings in the 30s and 40s. Donald Trump's approval ratings were never above water when he was president. Joe Biden had a little flash in the early days of his presidency, but then was seen pretty negatively through most of his presidency. So it may be we have to recalibrate this relationship over time. But it just says that the Democrats were in a very difficult position to have an incumbent who was so disliked. To have an approval rating of 38% doesn't mean it was just Democrats liked him and Republicans didn't. It was broader based than that, and the broad dissatisfaction with the state of the country is part of that. So although Biden was not on the ballot, his presence was certainly felt. This is part of a worldwide pattern. Some of you may have seen this figure that was in the Financial Times just after the election that tells a story of incumbent parties and incumbent governments around the world this year having very different experiences from governments in other elections. This is all of the elections in major democracies from the 1950s until this year, showing whether they gained votes or lost votes relative to their previous election. So are they picking up support or losing it? And you can see that in most years, there are some governments, incumbent parties or incumbent presidents or prime ministers who do better than their prior election, and some do worse. It's what you'd expect. That's the kind of accountability that voters can exact on a government. But 2024 is different from all of those, that there have essentially been no incumbent governments that have made up ground. Not all of them have lost power, but they've all lost votes in Germany, in Canada, in the UK, in Japan, in France, and in the United States. If anything, the losses were less in the United States. That's the red dot, which is the smallest of the declines in 2024. So the Democrats held off what could have been a worse outcome for them, especially down the ballot. There's a little sign of this happening maybe in 2023 and 2022, but there were some governments there that had more success. So there's a worldwide funk, I think, that we don't quite understand that's present here, but also present in our sister democracies around the world. And it shows up in the way the vote shifted this time around relative to 2020. These are maps from the New York Times, and I'll just ask you to focus on the one on the right for the moment. This is the one we're living in now. It's the change in the vote in each county around the country relative to what it was 4 years before. So a red arrow indicates the vote was more favorable to Trump this time than it was 4 years ago. A blue arrow would mean more favorable towards the Democrats, and the length of the arrow shows how big the shift was. It's all red arrows in essentially every state. There are a few exceptions. The WOW counties are a small exception. Some of the suburbs around Atlanta are a small exception, but those, and just around Seattle, maybe. Out of 3,000 counties, those are the few exceptions. In blue states, in red states, in battleground states, the vote moved in Trump's direction, at least at the presidential level. The vote shift was smaller in many of the battlegrounds. You can see in Wisconsin, the arrows are shorter. In Michigan, in Pennsylvania, in parts of Georgia, in Arizona, Nevada. I think that reflects a more intense campaign and some success by the Democrats in those states to hold down the losses. It was not quite enough, at least at the presidential level, but did benefit them in Senate races and elsewhere. So if this is the only map you'd seen, you would expect this is what presidential elections are like. The country shifts to the left or shifts to the right or favors one party, and you see a kind of tide in every jurisdiction in that way. But the previous map from the New York Times, which fortunately is still online, shows a very different pattern. In 2020, the Democrats made up ground. Certainly Biden did better in the popular vote than Clinton did. He won by 4.5 points. She won by something like 2 points. And he won the Electoral College, whereas she lost it. But the pattern is one of some places going bluer and some places going redder. Even within states, there are arrows pointing in opposite directions. In Wisconsin, there are some places that were more favorable towards Biden than they had been to Clinton, and some places doing the opposite. There's some clear state effects. Colorado moves to the left and Utah moves to the right, even though they're next door to one another. It's a very complicated pattern of demographic groups and communities responding to those candidates in different ways. It was not a national imprint in the way that 2024 is. So anything that happens on that large a scale has to have a large explanation. And I think the general dissatisfaction about the economy and apparently lots of other things in the US and around the world is part of that story. One last thing I don't think we have noticed as much is the kinds of voters who made this shift possible. And I'll just give you 2 pieces of evidence on this. This is still preliminary given what we know about the election, but there's some evidence that the late deciding voters, the voters who were not especially engaged, not paying a lot of attention, not particularly partisan, but who came to make up their mind in the final days of the campaign were disproportionately Trump voters. On the left, you have from the national exit polls the question asking people, when did you make up your mind? From at the bottom, well before the fall, so probably before Harris was the nominee, up until just the last week or the last few days. Of those who made up their mind in the last few days, they were disproportionately Trump voters. Right? These are the late-breaking voters, and in earlier periods, they were either Harris voters or nearly even tied between the two. On the right is some separate polling from a Republican pollster, I think telling the same story, so this is not exit polls, but interviewing people over time throughout the campaign, whether it's in the presidential vote, which is up top, or even in the congressional, which is on the bottom, or the presidential vote above it. Those late-breaking voters who decided either on election day or in the last few days were disproportionately Trump voters. And the Trump campaign told us those were the kinds of voters they were going after. Low propensity, as they described them, sort of marginal voters who were not likely to show up on their own and needed some prodding and attention. These were probably younger voters, men more than women, people of color more than white voters. Those are some of the groups that appear to have moved more dramatically in Trump's direction and maybe were successfully targeted by him. This is also an explanation for why the polls were not quite right this time. They were pretty darn good, but you saw the New York Times had Harris up by a point at the end. She ended up losing by 1.5 points. If there's late-breaking movement in the final days of the campaign, that would not be picked up by the polls, which typically stop in mid to late October. So it's possible the polls were perfectly accurate where they were, at least the public polling we have seen, but things continued to move and moved in Trump's direction for voters who were sort of tuning in late and interested in seeing something different happen. So that's my rough accounting for things I think that provide 2 different possible narratives for what has happened this year. I don't know which one of them is right. As I say, I think it's some combination of a little bit of a wiggle that's pretty interesting and different and did produce a different outcome than we would have gotten, say, with Joe Biden or without an assassination or with a different kind of Republican convention. But there are also some obviously big structural forces behind the scenes that are probably out of the reach of the campaigns. And sometimes voters are able to exact their preferences without the campaigns doing much to get in the way. So let me wrap up just a little early there, if we're able, and shift to our first session. We have several speakers today. All of them are in the room except for one person, Brian Schaffner, who's our next speaker who couldn't be with us. But I think you're going to enjoy his presentation. It's really going to set the stage for the rest of today. So let me welcome to the podium